Good morning, everyone, and happy Halloween to all. Thank you so very much for getting up on a Saturday to engage with us at the Chicago History Museum for the first part of our day-long program on Lovecraft Country and the ties to Chicago. My name is Erica Griffin. I am the Public and Community Engagement Manager at the Chicago History Museum, and I will be part of the moderating team today. Joining me, we have Brittany Hutchinson, a bioarchaeologist, historic preservationist, and assistant curator at the Chicago History Museum. Also, Julius Jones, PhD candidate in American history at the University of Chicago, and also an assistant curator at the Chicago History Museum. And last but certainly not least, our moderator for all of our programs today, Dr. Stanford Carpenter, who is a cultural anthropologist and also a comic scholar. We wanted to start our program today. Obviously, Chicago is what brought us all here. That's that unifier with the show. And we're using CHM's collected materials to help us dive a little bit deeper into this show and its impact and how the show really in a unique and creative way has activated a lot of these histories and speculated new futures. So we're going to start with a poll question to see just how much you all know about the show and also Chicago neighborhoods. So we're going to go ahead and launch our poll. So the question is very simple. For those of you that have seen the show, and even if you haven't, you might be able to figure this out based on Chicago history. So what Chicago neighborhood did the characters live in at the beginning of the show? And by characters, we mean Letty and Ruby and Uncle George and Dee and Aunt Hippolyta, Tick when he came back home, and of course, Montrose. So where in the city could you have found this many African-American people in this vibrant community in and around 1955 Chicago? And the answers are pouring in. We are going to give it about 10 more seconds, and then we will share the results with you all. Looks like we have some scholars here with us today. All right, so here we are with our results. And those of you that guessed Bronzeville, you are 100% correct. Bronzeville was that neighborhood that our characters were set in, that sort of served as the home base for the entire show. And Bronzeville is an amazing place. It is extremely unique, but also very, very much so Chicago. And Stanford, I wanted to sort of get your take as, our Lovecraft scholar on our program today. How did you feel seeing Bronzeville portrayed on the show? Why do you think the author of the book chose to set our story there?
Well, I love Bronzeville. Bronzeville is, it's where I live. But it's also the place where African Americans settled into Chicago during the Great Migration. Before it was settled, there really wasn't a lot here. It was an unoccupied space in a city that had many spaces where Black people were not welcome. We're going to have Julius, who's going to tell us a little bit more about who's going to tell us a little more about the community of Bronzeville.
Yes, so the name Bronzeville actually comes from the hue of the people who lived in the community. So originally, the neighborhood's official title is, Douglas and Oakland, but it came to be known as in Grand Crossing, but it came to be known as Bronzeville as a way to sort of instill racial pride in the recently arrived residents of that community. So if you're looking at this map here, you're really sort of seeing the heart of what was known as the Bronzeville community. So even before the Dan Ryan Freeway was built, along State Street, along then Parkway, now known as King Drive, and around Cottage Grove, these were all of the thoroughfares of the Bronzeville community running north to south. And it stretched all the way from what's now almost the Stevens Expressway, all the way down to 63rd, or in some instances, some people say it stretched all the way down to 67. So you're talking about a massive expanse that really became the heart of the city's African American community. Additionally, streets such as 35th and 37th running east to west were also known for their vibrant cultural institutions, restaurants and clubs and other sort of things. What really became the heart of what was known as the Black metropolis, a name for the large amounts of economic commerce taking place in this space. So there was, as Stanford mentioned, a vibrancy as you had both, old settlers and new migrants coming together in this community, constantly interacting and engaging with one another. And as historian Timur Black said, you really felt like you were growing up in a city inside a city, right? Your own sort of Black metropolis, Bronzeville community that was uniquely your own.
Absolutely. And to me, that makes Bronzeville the ideal setting for this type of engagement. And Julius, if you could navigate us through the street that we see here. Some of you may know it, of course, but take us on a little trip down the streets and clue us in more on Bronzeville.
Yes. So what you see here is Parkway, and on your right is the old Supreme Liberty Life Building, and right in the center, that statue is the Victory Monument, dedicated to the African American men of the Illinois Fighting Eighth who served with valor and distinction on the Western Front during the war, the Great War, which we now know as World War One. And so we are following this drone footage down King Drive. You're really sort of seeing one of the main thoroughfares of the community. People such as Ida B. Wells Barnett, John H. Johnson, the founder of Ebony and Jet magazine, all called this street home. And it was a key sort of major thoroughfare of commerce in business, and really sort of that community of vibrancy that really defined Bronzeville throughout the mid 20th century.
Thank you for that, Julius. And now, if you could give us just your take on this institution, this newspaper that was definitely local but had a national reach and did play a role in calling people north and adding to the numbers that were the sort of might of the African American community in Bronzeville.
Absolutely. So the Chicago Defender was founded in 1906 by Robert Abbott, and it was he who coined the term the promised land for Chicago, calling Southern migrants up to Chicago out of places like Mississippi and Alabama, Louisiana, calling them to Chicago that could be a place for opportunity for them. And so he really um, built a media empire, then passing on the torch of succession to his nephew, John Sistecki, who worked to really sort of make the Defender the largest and most prominent African American newspaper in the United States in the 20th century, one of only three daily African American newspapers at its height in the late 1950s through the early 2000s. It was published every day, which was a feat for an African American newspaper at the time. So what you see here on the screen are three of the headquarters of the Chicago Defender, historic landmarks, the Motor Row building, which is in the top left corner, the original building on Indiana, and then the current building, which is on Martin Luther King Drive. So again, a venerable cultural institution, sort of vital to the vibrancy of Bronzeville that is in existence to this very day.
Absolutely. Thank you, Julius. And, when I think about Bronzeville and how vibrant it was, and how it literally was a city within a city for this continuous swell of Black people moving into the area. But for me, there's also this idea of safety. The boundaries of Bronzeville, on one hand, kept people safe, and you knew where you could go, you knew where your neighborhood was, and at the same time, it limited African American people there. They could not move about as freely as they would have wanted outside of those boundaries. They could not, for instance, purchase homes or set up businesses that easily once you moved out of that space. And in the show, Stanford, there is this idea of movement. You know, when you leave your safe place and go somewhere else, or, you know, when harm comes into your neighborhood. And I'm wondering if you could sort of share your take on those instances and how Bronzeville in the show, at one hand, kept our wonderful characters safe, but also those lines sort of blurred and were crossed again and again by different people.
Well, that really comes down. One of the things that's interesting about the horror genre is a lot of the in horror, you have a lot of morality tales. You have a lot of stories that have to do with boundaries, right? It's you tell your protagonist, don't go into the woods at night, right? Something bad will happen to you. What's interesting is about Chicago as a city is that we forget that Chicago is one of the largest metropolitan areas or metropolises in square feet. So it's very flat, it's very spread out. So what it means is that the boundaries start to become even more important, and this is also at a time where, we will be talking later about sundown towns, but there are a lot of sundown neighborhoods within Chicago, neighborhoods where people of color just weren't, it's not just that they weren't welcome, it's that they were so not welcome that harm could come to them. So that just actually just further drove down to the populace that Bronzeville was this place. At the same time, because you've got Bronzeville as a safe space, right? It actually forced a different kind of development. Like you had to see your doctor, your lawyer, your insurance person, all in that community. It's not like you would go to another community for services, and that actually in some ways contributed to the health and to the vibrancy of Bronzeville at that time. And we see that a lot in the show where they start in Bronzeville. It's this very thriving place, and they refer to Bronzeville as Chicago because Bronzeville was Chicago to African Americans at the time. And then you've got this newspaper, The Defender, which is being distributed outside of Bronzeville, but not just outside in the city, but it's being distributed to other states. And so it really does drive home, a different Chicago for Black people.
Absolutely. And, a couple of things there that you mentioned. One, definitely is this idea of when you exit outside, harm could come to you. When you cross these imaginary or real boundaries, that's where danger lies. That idea of real horror in the real world, which we saw a lot of in the show. And one of my favorite episodes, and I'm sure a lot of you here have a similar feeling, was the Tulsa episode. It was so beautifully done. It was very, very hard to watch all of that destruction happening in that amazing area in Tulsa of 1921. But I also want to sort of make it known that instance of racialized violence was not in a vacuum, that it was mirrored all across the country. And Bronzeville, for as large as it was and as vibrant as it was, it also saw its fair share of racialized violence. And I'm going to pull up our next poll question to see if we can get some answers on this one. So similar to Tulsa and its feature in the show, there was a massive race riot in Chicago. So we're wanting to see if we can get an idea from you all, the audience, when that instance was. It was over a week long of violence with people coming into the Bronzeville area, wreaking havoc, bombing homes, looting businesses. 38 people were killed, most of them African American. Hundreds left homeless, injured. It was a blight on Chicago's history. But Bronzeville being what it was, it did rebound and it did persevere. So once again, most of you are correct. That year was 1919. And that summer, in this instance began July 27, 1919, that entire summer saw racialized violence all across the country. That summer of 1919 is known as the Red Summer. And to give us some more context for the race riot, Brittany, if you could walk us through that story and how Chicago and Bronzeville came to the aid of its African American residents.
Sure. So I think what's required of us is sort of establish what happened was the sort of the spark that led to this 7-day long stretch of honestly domestic terrorism that was enacted against African Americans, largely at the hands of white Chicagoans. So what we have is a situation where a young teen, Eugene Williams, inadvertently and accidentally floated into the sort of white section of the water at the 29th Street beach, where he was attacked by white beachgoers. Police didn't respond when they were alerted of the circumstance, and what happened thereafter again was, of course, what we call a riot, but again was an act of domestic terrorism. So in addition to this initial murder, there was the sort of other elements that led to how bad things really got. Namely, the mayor at the time, William Thompson, did not call the National Guard in until 4 days into the violence and the death and the destruction. And eventually, the one person who was prosecuted for the murder of Eugene Williams, he was actually acquitted. So you have this very unfortunately familiar element of a very real Black victim and a sort of non-existent assailant that happens in many cases we still see today. So if we're looking at this particular event from the aspect of our medical facilities in Chicago, which is a unique position to take, but I want to point out that there is this article, sort of the clip at the upper right-hand corner is from the Tribune, and that article is was published on July 29th, so 2 days into the attacks. And in that article, it's sort of reporting out of what's happening within these, hospitals on the South Side. And there's a total of 9 that are recorded upon. So 8 of those 9 hospitals saw a collective total of 11 patients were admitted to the emergency room. One of those patients was African American. The other hospital, the one remaining hospital of the 9, was Provident Hospital. And just for reference, Provident Hospital was the very first Black owned and operated hospital in the United States. And it was established by Dr. Daniel Hale Williams, who also performed the very first open heart surgery in Chicago in 1893. Just want to get that out there. So Provident, its staff of 10 doctors, 15 nurses, and 3 interns saw over 100 patients who were victims of this domestic terrorist attack. So if you're looking at what happens in Chicago in these spaces, in Bronzeville and sort of the South Side in general, if you were in one of those, white owned and operated hospitals, you would never know the sheer magnitude of what was happening in the city. And you wouldn't know that the majority of the violence was enacted against African-American men, women, and children. Many of which who were innocent, and there are reports of people on their way to work and being attacked simply because they're Black. So this disparity, I think, kind of begs the question of what does it mean when space is racialized, right? So in thinking of this show itself, we see different sort of instances of people moving throughout the country, moving throughout the city, and how they're encountering racism and these larger monsters, right, that are terrorizing them. But I think this historical event in Chicago, and in the sort of context of the show with Tulsa, and of course the Red Summer of 1919, the larger conversation around how space is protected against quote unquote outsiders and what those measures are. And a lot of times it is violence. So when we're talking about how this sort of comes about, again, 1919 and the Red Summer of 1919 and the subsequent years of domestic terrorist attacks against Black residents and citizens of this country, we think of what comes to pass. And we're also kind of relating this to that first wave of the Great Migration. So you have Black people essentially descending upon, quote unquote, northern cities in predominantly white areas. There was actually some reports in a few magazines that sort of called it an invasion, right? An invasion of Black lives and Black experiences in occupation. So I think also to kind of maybe more abstractly expand that racialization of space and that concept is to look at the actual title of the program that we're talking about, Lovecraft Country. And I think we'd be remiss if we didn't mention sort of the reference to H.P. Lovecraft, who was an author and sort of the pioneer of this genre of sci-fi horror, which of course the show does, of course, fit within that genre, but also H.P. Lovecraft's individual personal politics were full of virulent and abject racism. He literally hated everyone that wasn't white and particularly hated Black people. He was also noted as sort of lauding the efforts of the South, both illegal and legal efforts of the South to maintain and uphold segregation. So in H.P. Lovecraft's mind, and it's also visible in some of his work, this idea of an all-white utopia. And this idea of an all-white utopia was something that was at the forefront of his mind and a lot of Americans. So we see that there is this difference between the population from 1910 and 1920 due to that first wave of the Great Migration. So this sort of influx of Black people in Chicago and also in other areas became that kind of created that fever pitch and that racial tension that, you know, invading a quote unquote white space results in that violence. And so if we're going to, again, pull back a little bit more and conceptualize, you know, this show and, you know, the reference to H.P. Lovecraft, the genre in and of itself, and Chicago history within the larger context of U.S. history, one, we can see that the Great Migration and Black people entering quote unquote white spaces is, you know, reacted through with violence. But also sort of we can understand that for a very long time, and in many ways, the North was this white utopia, a place where Black people are in the country, but they're not in the North. So if we think of the extent to which racism is running through this story, running through this particular historical event, it's no wonder that this particular show and this story is centered in Chicago. I think that Chicago history in particular offers a great opportunity and access to understanding how African Americans are experiencing the United States in different parts of the country. So here in the North, some invisible assailant might, you know, hurt you in broad daylight, versus in the South, some white sheet-clad ghost will come snatch you up in the middle of the night. So I think it's a perfect setting for the show, and sort of how space is being racialized and how moving through that space can be deadly for African Americans.
Absolutely. Thank you, Brittany. And to your point, that idea of movement sometimes indicating a violent episode that could lead to death, that brings us to our comments on Emmett Till. And before we move on, I wanted to make mention all of the images that we're seeing here have been pulled from the Chicago History Museum's archive. And in a bit, we'll speak more in our upcoming segments on how museums and other spaces activate these different pieces that are representative of different histories. But to your point, Brittany, yes, you know, movement can sometimes indicate, you know, extreme violence, especially when that movement is done by a person who is African American or has been othered by mainstream society. And Julius, if you could you walk us through the Emmett Till story, such as we have on the screen?
Yes, so Emmett Till was born in 1941 here in Chicago. And like many Chicagoans, he had family roots in Mississippi. And so in the summer of 1955, at 14 years old, he went to visit his family in Mississippi. And while there, he was lynched. The story has sort of evolved over many years, including the white woman who accused him of being inappropriate with her in her family store, Carol Bryant, recently retracting her story. So the fact is, we will never know exactly the full circumstances of what happened in that store. However, what we do know is once Carol's husband, Roy, returned from a business trip, Carol told him about how Emmett had allegedly interacted with her. And since um, uh, Mr. Bryant and his half brother, a man by the name of J.W. Milliam, went to the home of Till's great uncle, Mose Wright, where Till was staying on the night of August 28th, 1955, and took Emmett Till from that home. Eventually, Emmett's body was found in a sunken, watery grave, um, heavily disfigured and covered in barbed wire and attached to a piece of farming equipment to cause his body to sink into the water. And this sort of heavily disfigured image was featured in Jet Magazine, a Chicago-based publication of John H. Johnson's Johnson Publishing Company. And Till's mother, Mamie Till Mosby, was adamant that she wanted an open casket because she wanted people to see what had been done to her child. And so one of the pictures you see on the screen is Miss Till Mosby standing in front of her son's casket. You also see a list of mourners, a line of mourners in front of the Roberts Temple Church of God in Christ, where the funeral was held. So many people believe that the publishing of this image of this heavily disfigured 14-year-old boy was a key sort of starting point in the civil rights movement. Ultimately, and what you see on the screen are sketches from the trial where Mr. Bryant and Mr. Milliam were charged and ultimately acquitted by an all-white jury. After their acquittal, the two men later went on a radio program and bragged about, in fact, having committed the murder and admitted their guilt and were never punished for doing so. And so it was this instance which is featured in the show, some not prominently, but it is very much an element of this program, and I think really sort of speaks to the ideas that Stanford was talking about in terms of sort of sort of finding yourself in a place in which your varied embodied blackness makes violence almost likely to occur to you in some way. So yeah.
And one thing that's also interesting is how the show treats this moment in history, right? Like many, I grew up knowing about Emmett Till and understanding the significance of his body being displayed in an open casket, and at some point in my life, I did see the image that's up there with the crowd of people, waiting to come in to also line up and see the body. But what was interesting about the show is they introduced Emmett Till in the third episode. And in that episode, Letty is having a party at a house that she's purchased that we will find out later is haunted. We'll talk about that later in the tour and later in the other panels. But Tick's cousin, Dee, right, she's also 14, and she has this friend Bobo, and we see her and some of her friends, one of them being Bobo, and Bobo was the nickname for Emmett Till, are playing with the Ouija board, right? They're doing all of these things that children do. And I actually found that to be one of the things that's incredibly interesting, and also the source of horror in this show, right, is that instead of being introduced to Emmett Till as a symbol of racial violence, we're introduced to him as a child, a kid who does kid-type things, all the kid-type things that we used to do. And that's not the only time he shows up in the show. He shows up a couple episodes later, and then it builds up to an episode where there are all these references to him going to visit his family in Mississippi over the summer. and he does go to visit, and he just doesn't, and he goes to visit, he doesn't come back. And then one of the later episodes opened with a recreation of the very scene that you have on the screen right now, where you have a lot of people out in front of Robert's temple. So it humanizes that instance, and it drives home this horror that you could have a child doing all the things that children do, being not really to blame for anything, innocent, right? And what he does is he leaves the space of safety. He crosses that border, and that activates the response.
Mm-hmm.
Absolutely, yeah, and we keep coming back to, and it was quite made quite clear on the show that it's these transgression of boundaries that leads to the violence or the monsters or the horror. And for Chicago, as we've been saying throughout the program, it was starkly clear where Black people's place was, where they could be, where they could thrive, be themselves, create community, and have some semblance of that safety. And for the most part, early in the sort of Great Migration and the pattern of people coming up to Chicago from the South, that place was Bronzeville. But there were some other places where you could find African-American people where they had coalesced around each other and developed community. And one of those is the 4600 block of North Winthrop. And Brittany, if you could take us through this part of the city and this history that I really knew nothing about. I did not know anything about this, and it was shocking. And when Brittany, when you're done, we'll toss it to Stanford to speak to Winthrop featured in the show, which was quite clever.
So 4600 North Winthrop Avenue. The block itself was, as early as the 1910s, one of the rare areas outside of Bronzeville on the south side of the city where Black families could live and own houses. And because of that, over the years, it became this sort of safe haven, again, sort of mimicking that safety within Bronzeville, but just away from that particular area. I mean, being in the north side in Uptown, it was particularly remarkable, again, because most people were made to live in a very small region, especially as the second wave of the Great Migration comes along. It becomes overcrowded and dangerous just in that aspect, right? So, this block was a place where Black families who were able to afford to live outside of the block of Bronzeville or anywhere they wanted, were able to find a place to live where they could be. And in this space, they did thrive. There were, I think, the first Black priest of the Archdiocese of Chicago grew up on this block, and a few other notable folks. So the block clubs, the family picnics, the block parties were definitely part of this community and helped it grow and thrive and sort of flourish and to maintain that sanctuary. But what I think is particularly interesting about this block, just historically speaking, is not only just the vibrance of Black people living and thriving in this area, but the boundaries that they had to cross and the barriers they had to maneuver around to get to this area. Again, it was first settled in the 1910s, so before sort of a critical mass of migration to Chicago. But that's also significant because it precedes some of these barriers that become law and policy practice in the city. So there are, many barriers, number one, but the main three that I kind of want to go over that happen here in Chicago have to do with one, redlining, two, contract selling, which I'll get into, and three, restrictive covenants, which is more kind of closely related to what I'm going to talk about with this particular instance in this episode, in this moment in the episode. So when we talk about housing in Chicago, I think it's important to mention that it was a rampant problem, like the closed housing market here. I mean, today it still is, but it was so notable that it was the reason that Dr. King decided to move the sort of focus of the civil rights movement that he was leading to Chicago to draw attention to exactly how bad and how terrible the situation and circumstances were. So to kind of touch on a few of those major components to what would serve as barriers is that, so Number one, redlining, I think that we're fairly familiar with, which is essentially sort of the banks discriminating against African-American families in ways of not loaning them money for either securing the capital to buy a home or to repair a home. Contract selling, which is, I think, maybe lesser known, and that essentially is sort of a barrier presented by realtors who are exploiting Black families who do have the capital and access to capital to buy a home. So instead of the bank denying you money, there's a realtor who is then exploiting the funds that you have. And so what happened with contracts is that an independent realtor would purchase a house below market value, typically after intimidating white families who own that house to move away out of threat of sort of Black invasion in their neighborhood. So fueling the fire of white flight to purchase a house below market value and then selling it on contract to Black families. And what would happen with that contract is the price of the house would be inflated, sometimes double or more what it was actually worth. So if you bought a house for $7,000, you'd sell it for 14. B, the contract and being on contract meant that there were no protections or restrictions or codes that a realtor had to follow. It was an individual person-to-person exchange. So you would have, this inflated cost and inflated interest. And the terms of the contract would be such that if you were to be late on one payment or by a day, by an hour, whatever the realtor decided was appropriate, he could evict you immediately without any sort of due process or any sort of filing of documents or paperwork. Also, the interest rates were then, it could fluctuate, as well as there was a few instances of where the original cost of the house that's on the contract could be increased at the discretion of the realtor. So you get caught in this cycle of constantly owing more and more money, paying more than white people would pay for the same house in the same area, if it's even in the same area. And then also what happens with Black families is during this process of keeping up with these very heavy, very inflated, imposing payments, is that there was no equity accrued on that house for that family. So there's an automatic barrier to wealth, right? Not just capital and money, but the sort of building of wealth within the family. And I believe there's a study conducted by Duke University and University of Illinois Chicago some years ago, very recently though, that quantified exactly the amount, or relatively, or estimate, I guess I should say, the amount of wealth lost from Black families due to this process in the 1950s and 60s, and that's about upwards of $3 billion. So this was a pervasive, extremely detrimental process that realtors themselves forced upon Black families. And so the third element in sort of major barrier here that kind of relates to this block and the rarity of this block being inhabited by Black Chicagoans is a restrictive covenant. So a restrictive covenant, in the way that redlining is a sort of bank restriction or discrimination, contract selling is realtor level of actually affording the house and buying the house. Restrictive covenants are property level discriminatory practices, the legal document, right? So a restrictive covenant is a legally binding contract that is attached to the deed of land or a particular piece of property. And those covenants, the racially restricted covenants, dictated that you could not sell, rent, or otherwise allow the occupation of a particular space or property by African Americans until the end of the term of that covenant. And so what we see happening, and they've been in practice for maybe the mid-19 teens or so, but in the 1920s, we see them starting to pop up across Chicago, the first of which in Cook County was noted in Evanston in 1924. And then we start seeing them within the city proper around that time as well. On our screen, we have from our collection within Archibald Motley Jr.'s papers. Really quickly, Archibald Motley Jr. Was a prolific African-American painter from Chicago. He graduated from the Art Institute in 1918. And his family, he actually moved here with his parents. His father was a sleeping car porter, which gave him access to the middle class and of course, some mobility across the housing market in Chicago. But to kind of really quickly divert, there's a scene in that first episode, the sort of block party scene. It's very reminiscent of one of Motley Jr.'s paintings, and it's called Barbecue. So if you have a minute, whenever you want, just check that out and kind of refer to that first episode, that block party. It's to me, it just reminds me of that painting. But to kind of go back to the point I was trying to make is that so this is a letter that was sent to Archibald Motley Jr.'s parents, Archibald Motley Sr., directly addressed to him, from the Inglewood Property Restriction Association. So these property restriction associations pop up across the city, and their main focus and point is to convince and urge homeowners to sign restrictive covenants. And so the fact that this Black family who'd been in Chicago for decades, I think they moved up from New Orleans in the late 1800s, to even get this letter is showing just how freely people were soliciting this type of action to be taken. So the practice itself of enacting restrictive covenants begins in the 20s, of course, and it's outlawed in 1948. However, many of those contracts that were signed during that time, they didn't end or they weren't matured until the 1980s. So you could have a house in 1975 in a particular neighborhood in Chicago that still had this covenant attached to the deed for that property. So to kind of recap, the barriers that existed were access to the capital, not being, exploited by a realtor. And then even if you got past the capital, you got a realtor who was honest, where you could live was literally attached to the property that you wanted to buy. So this block, again, is remarkable in that sense. Again, people were moving there before restricted covenants and before redlining and before contracts suddenly really took off. So that was kind of the opportunity moment to inhabit this block. But I think it's also an interesting point to make in the show where the house is haunted, right? So we think of home as sanctuary, as a safe space, and this block in particular did present that safety to the inhabitants and the residents of this area. And there were no reports of hauntings on the historical record, but it's an interesting choice because I think that as we start to learn more about, again, the racialization of space and occupying white spaces and home ownership, the experience of those who were able to move into white neighborhoods and essentially desegregate them in some measure were terrorized. It would be like living in a haunted house. It would be like knowing that you should feel safe and you should feel welcome and you should feel at home. But what the show does is kind of take that sort of ideal of home ownership and sanctuary and turn it on its head to kind of reflect the realities of what's happening external to Black families in white neighborhoods, is that neighborhood is haunting and terrorizing that family. So I think that's another idea of how, or instance of how the racializing space and what those reactions look like within this show, and of course within Chicago's history.
And one of the things that's also really interesting about the way the show handles it is part of what makes these shows work is what they fictionalize. So what they do is they name the house the Winthrop House, right, as a reference to the block in Winthrop. But it's also set up previously in a conversation between Letty and Ruby, where Letty refers to trying to move out to the north side, i.e., moving out of Bronzeville. But Winthrop was not the only place that Black people lived up north. I mean, there's another location that was also featured in Lovecraft Country, which is Cabrini Green, which many of you know as a housing development that's located right where Lincoln Park is now, and it's to some degree been erased through history. Julius, could you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah. So here, what you see are the Trumbull Park, housing community. And Trumbull Park was one of Chicago's first public housing projects built by the Chicago Housing Authority using federal funding in 1938. And as per the policy of the federal government is public housing could not be used as a vehicle to integrate the communities in which they were built. So if a public housing unit was built in a community that was predominantly white, then all of the residents of that housing community had to be white. And so this was the policy that CHA used when selecting residents for the Trumbull Park projects. However, there was a racial incident that occurred in 1954 when the CHA accidentally allowed an African American woman and her family to move into the community. A woman by the name of Betty Howard, who was very fair skinned, it could pass for white, even though there's some debate whether or not she actually did pass for, she was intentionally trying to pass for white. She just went to apply for an apartment and they thought she was white, so they didn't ask her race. Her and her family moved in to the apartment unit, and when they did, it is safe to say that all hell broke loose, right? Their home was ransacked. Their belongings were thrown out on the street. They had to sort of have police escorts to go in and out of the community. And while ultimately they were allowed to stay after the National Guard was sort of called in to quell the race riot, this incident really sort of locked into place this sort of policy of racial segregation in public housing that in a lot of ways would remain the policy of public housing throughout its entire existence, right? That public housing units were racially segregated in the city of Chicago.
Absolutely. And there was a mention of this very incident that you're talking about, Julius, in the show. So I want to say episode 3, Letty and Ruby were sort of talking about now being in this house during the party, and they referenced this happening. So this was very real. And I really love the way that the writers and the producers wove these different Chicago stories and places and spaces into the show and activated them. And it's almost, it is entertainment, but it's a history lesson at the same time, because I would wager that most people have not heard of this particular instance of racialized violence in relation to the show. And, there's a larger conversation to be had on public housing as we move throughout the day. But there was also another mention of the Cabrini Green Housing Project. And it was a part of Montrose's amazing story, which we are running out of time to get into. But Julius, if you could just navigate us through the physical space that we see here, which is where Cabrini Green stood.
Yeah, so Cabrini Green is fascinating. So what you are looking at is where Green once stood. So Cabrini Green is 2 housing projects, right? And the first one was the Francis Cabrini row houses, which are actually still standing. So as the video is turning, what you see there are the Francis Cabrini row houses, which are still there to the very day. And many people don't know that. And this was actually sort of the model of public housing that the experts sort of recommended. They said you should build low density, low rise public housing, and that is sort of the best way to deal with tamping down on some of the issues of blight and disrepair and sort of despair that comes in large scale high rise public housing. And so CHA completely ignored this advice and built massive high rise apartment units. So and those were the green homes, right, which were immediately to the north of the Francis Cabrini row houses. And eventually over 15,000 people would live in this massive complex that was unique because it was one of the few housing complexes for African Americans outside of the Black Belt in Chicago or Bronzeville, right? And so part of why it sort of became a fixation was because of some of the horrible conditions, the policy of neglect that the CHA used towards them, the sort of horrible, tragic incidences of crime and violence. But as you know, if you've ever been where Cabrini Green, Green was located now, it is sort of prime real estate on the north side of Chicago. And so nearly as soon as these housing units were built, people wanted these housing units gone. And beginning in the mid 90s, the CHA began tearing down those buildings, and no one sort of missed them when they were gone because of some of the things that had taken place in there. But it was definitely sort of a end of an era, and you have sort of residents sort of talking about building community in what were deplorable and unimaginably harsh conditions.
Okay, thank you, thank you. So one of the questions that we have here for the from the audience is would you guys consider the xenophobia to be more class or race based? One of the questions, and I think the question emerges out of some of these discussions around housing, et cetera. What would you have to say to that?
Oh, well, I don't think there's any question that this was racially based. I think that it became self-evident when you look at attempts to integrate public housing, particularly because those proponents of integrating public housing in the 1930s were very sort of explicit in choosing who they would allow to integrate. So you look at an instance of challenging restrictive covenants, which my colleague spoke about in the Hansberry. So Lorraine Hansberg family, her father's attorney, they're all college educated. So they are certainly of a very high class station. And, the restrictive covenant was not based on what college degree you had or how much money you made, it was based on the color of your skin. So we know for a fact that these restrictions were based on race, and that the federal government through housing policy had explicitly demarcated race as synonymous with value. So when we look at things like the Federal Housing Authority, they engaged in a practice of redlining in which they basically said that communities that were racially mixed with people of color or majority people of color, they deemed as undesirable. And so you can literally see maps of Chicago where the black belt is shaded in red. And basically what that means is that the federal government will not insure or back your mortgage. And that is sort of the basis of the modern home buying system, right? People who are able to go get mortgages for 30 years, automatic mortgages, are able to do so because the federal government, you may have heard of Freddie Mae and Fannie Mac, are essentially guaranteeing that mortgage and insuring it as sort of a backstop if you are unable to pay. So this sort of insurance brought by the federal government is what allowed the modern sort of home buying financial sort of edifice that allowed millions of people to purchase homes beginning in the 1950s to exist. And African Americans and other racial minorities were explicitly excluded from that process, and they were excluded because of their race.
Can I jump in really quickly?
Sure.
Sort of, I think everything you said, obviously, but then sort of creating that class based off of these restrictions based on race is kind of interconnecting the two. So one leads to and also involves the other in that question. So that's it.
And just to help our audience have a better, a more refined sense of locale, Brittany, do you know offhand what the street boundaries were for the 4600 block of Winthrop?
That I don't know off the top of my head. It was that one block. So I think that from what I've read, there were no other sort of boundaries that described which streets it began and ended with. It was just the one block of 4600 North Winthrop.
I mean, a couple of people are asking questions to get a better sense of just the economy of Bronzeville. What it was like. Was there a thriving middle class? Was it economically depressed? Could you guys give us a better just flesh out what Bronzeville was like as a city within a city?
Yeah. So one of the things that people who describe Bronzeville say is because of the racial segregation in housing throughout the city is sort of every type of African American lived in very close proximity to one another. So you had a great deal of professional African Americans, doctors, lawyers, educators, a great deal of police officers. African Americans have served in law enforcement in Chicago since immediately after the turn of the 20th century. So you had all of these different classes of people living in Bronzeville, but you also had what was known as the Federal Street slums, but also a part of Bronzeville. So people, lived in abject poverty as well. So there was a huge range of diversity in the neighborhood that people, when you talk to people who lived through the experience, they actually sort of speak to it in a somewhat, longing manner, because what sort of happens in Chicago at the turn of the century is that you see a class-based segregation sort of infused in the African American community. So public housing is built along Federal Street, so the Robert Taylor homes, and so African Americans of lower social economic status move into public housing, whereas African Americans of means begin moving out of Bronzeville as opportunities in the immediate suburbs of Chicago to the south, and as well as opportunities to move into other places in the city begin to expand. You actually have almost a somewhat of a diaspora of African Americans of certain class stations out of the Black Belt.
I'll just add this. I did a quick look up. The 4600 block of Winthrop is essentially between Wilson and Leland.
So there are so many more outstanding questions. I mean, there are questions asking about other Black enclaves other than perhaps Winthrop. And the answer is we will get to those as we go on throughout the day. Other questions about LGBTQ and LGBTQ presence in Bronzeville. The answer is absolutely. It was vibrant. It was beautiful. And I encourage you all, if you are able to stick with us for the rest of the day, we will be diving into conversations on geography, on identity, on trauma, and what the position looks like for Chicago in the Afrofuture. So for those of you that are joining us for our next program, we will see you shortly. Those of you that have to sign off, thank you for joining us. You will receive a survey at the end of the day today. And if you could please provide your honest feedback, it is essential as we continue to shape and coax new engagement, new ways to explore Chicago's stories. So once you get it, please fill it out. We look forward to your feedback. Thank you all for joining. Panelists, any final thoughts you'd like to share with our audience?
This whole issue of Bronzeville, of being a city or a safe place within a city filled with sundown neighborhoods, is something we're going to pick up a lot more on in the next panel, as we talk about not just Chicago, but also sundown towns and what that means for identity and how we think of ourselves and safety, not just in the city, but as we travel across the country.
We will be seeing you soon virtually. Visit the website for more information on upcoming programs and events. Until we see you again, stay safe and be well. Thank you very much.